The air inside the grand banquet hall was thick with murmurs and clinking glasses. The city's most influential business figures had gathered under one roof, their tailored suits and designer gowns reflecting the wealth and power they carried. At the heart of it all was Nicholas Bennett, a man whose name alone commanded respect. In the corporate world, tall, confident, and impossibly successful, he had built his empire from the ground up, turning his company into a powerhouse of innovation. But tonight, it wasn't his business prowess that had captured everyone's attention. It was the woman sitting beside him. She wasn't like the other women in the room, polished, groomed for high society, used to the whispers of old money. No, she was different. The moment she walked in, heads turned. Some in curiosity, others in disbelief. The sharp eyes of the elite flickered with questions they didn't dare voice out loud. Why was a mere housekeeper sitting at the table of one of the wealthiest men in the city? Her name was Eleanor Carter, a woman who had spent years cleaning the very halls of Nicholas's estate, invisible to the world he thrived in. She had never imagined herself standing in the midst of such power, let alone seated beside a man who, in every way, was untouchable. But here she was, dressed in a borrowed gown, sitting at a table where she clearly didn't belong, at least, according to the people around her. It had all started with a simple request. Earlier that day, Nicholas's original date for the evening had cancelled at the last minute. He could have called another woman from his endless list of high-profile contacts, but instead, his gaze had landed on Eleanor as she moved through the house, quietly going about her work. Something about the idea had intrigued him. Maybe it was boredom, maybe it was the urge to challenge the expectations of the people around him, or maybe, deep down, he wanted to see how someone untouched by wealth would react in a world that revolved around it. "Come with me," he had said, standing in the doorway of the laundry room. Eleanor had looked up, confused. "Sir, to the business dinner. I need a +1. She had almost laughed, assuming he was joking. But when she met his gaze, she realized he wasn't. "I'm just your housekeeper," she had said carefully, and Nicholas had tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Do you know how to hold a fork? How to sit at a table? How to have a conversation? Of course I do. But then you'll do just fine." And just like that, she had found herself in a world she had only ever observed from the sidelines. Now, sitting beside him, Eleanor could feel the weight of the stares pressing down on her, the carefully concealed judgment, the forced smiles from women who saw her as a temporary joke, the men who barely acknowledged her presence. She should have felt small. She should have felt out of place, but she did in single quotes T. Instead, she lifted her chin, her hand steady as she reached for the wine glass in front of her. If Nicholas had brought her here expecting her to falter, he was in for a surprise, because Eleanor Carter wasn't just some housekeeper. And before the night was over, everyone in that room would know exactly who she was. Eleanor Carter took a slow sip of her wine, letting the rich taste settle on her tongue as the conversations around her hummed with restrained curiosity. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the subtle glances exchanged across the table, the way some of the guests leaned in just a little closer as if trying to catch her making a mistake. Nicholas, ever composed, showed no sign of discomfort. He sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable, swirling the drink in his glass as he listened to a discussion about market expansions. He wasn't looking at Eleanor, but she knew he was aware of the silent scrutiny she was under. She wasn't supposed to belong here. That's what they all believed. A woman who had spent years cleaning houses, scrubbing floors, living in the quiet shadows of people who never gave her a second thought. What could she possibly bring to a table where billion-dollar deals were being made? But what they didn't know was that Eleanor had spent her entire life listening, observing. She knew the world of the wealthy better than they realized, not because she was a part of it, but because she had spent years watching it from the outside. She had heard the late-night phone calls, the whispered betrayals, the arrogance of people who believed money made them untouchable. And she had learned. So, when the conversation shifted to a major investment opportunity, a deal that had every executive in the room eager to impress Eleanor did something that no one expected. She spoke. "That's a risky move," she said, setting her glass down lightly. The table fell silent. All eyes turned to her. Some looked amused, others surprised, but a few, especially the ones who had been bragging the loudest, looked irritated. Nicholas raised an eyebrow, a flicker of interest in his usually unreadable gaze. One of the senior executives, a man with graying hair and an air of entitlement, leaned forward. "Excuse me." Eleanor met his gaze without hesitation. "You're proposing an expansion into international markets without fully considering the cultural and economic differences. The regions you're targeting have strict government regulations on foreign businesses, and your strategy doesn't account for potential resistance." A tense pause filled the air. One of the women at the table let out a short, dismissive laugh. "And you would know this." "How exactly?" Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "Because I listen, and because I read." More silence. Nicholas didn't step in. He didn't try to rescue her from the judgment settling over the table, because he didn't need to. Eleanor continued, her voice steady. "Your company's previous attempt at international expansion was in South America, correct? The local economy was unstable at the time, and currency fluctuations hurt your profit margins more than you anticipated. You withdrew after 2 years. Suffering a significant loss, she turned to the man who had first spoken. "If I recall correctly, you were one of the key decision-makers behind that move." A flicker of discomfort crossed his face. The others at the table were listening now, not out of politeness, but out of genuine interest. Eleanor wasn't just speaking, she was challenging. Nicholas finally leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Go on," he said, his voice laced with amusement. Eleanor glanced at him briefly before continuing. "Expanding into a new market isn't just about opportunity, it's about understanding the risks. If you don't adapt to the cultural, legal, and economic landscapes of the countries you're entering, you're setting yourself up for failure." She folded her hands together. "The data is there. You just have to look beyond the numbers." The silence that followed was no longer dismissive. It was thoughtful. Nicholas's lips curved slightly, the closest thing to a smile he had shown all night. One of the younger executives, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "She's right," he admitted. "We've been so focused on the financial projections that we haven't accounted for the regulatory hurdles." Another man nodded. "We should take a second look at those regions before making any commitments." The shift in energy was undeniable, and for the first time that evening, Eleanor felt something change. They were no longer looking at her as just a housekeeper. They were listening. But just as the tension seemed to settle, a voice cut through the moment like a knife. "This is ridiculous." The graying executive, the one who had been most embarrassed by Eleanor's words, set down his glass. With a sharp clink, his face was carefully controlled, but the irritation in his eyes was unmistakable. Nicholas's gaze flickered to him, but he didn't speak. He was waiting. "Let's not get carried away," the man continued, forcing a thin smile. "No offense, Miss Carter, but you're out of your depth. Business isn't as simple as what you read in books or hear in passing. There are nuances you wouldn't understand." It was a challenge. It was a challenge. A dismissal wrapped in feigned politeness. Eleanor held his gaze. Feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She could back down. She could let the conversation move on, let the powerful men at the table regain control. Or she could prove that she wasn't just here to sit quietly. She could prove that she belonged. Taking a breath, she straightened her shoulders. "Well then," she said, her voice calm but firm, "why don't you enlighten me?" And with that, the tension in the room reached its peak, because for the first time in his life, Nicholas Bennett wasn't the most interesting person at his own business dinner. It was the housekeeper sitting beside him. The room was silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. All eyes were locked on Eleanor, waiting to see if she would falter, if she would shrink under the weight of the challenge thrown at her. But she didn't. She met the executive's gaze head-on, her expression steady, her confidence unwavering. Nicholas leaned back slightly, watching her with quiet amusement. He had expected her to hold her own, but he hadn't expected her to captivate an entire table of seasoned business moguls, and yet here she was doing exactly that. The executive gave a tight smile, as if humoring her. "All right," he said, voice smooth but laced with condescension. "Let's talk about business. Then, since you seem to have an interest in market strategies, tell me, what would you do differently if you were in our position?" Eleanor didn't hesitate. "I'd start by building local partnerships instead of forcing an outside model onto Anne. Unfamiliar market. You keep trying to dominate instead of integrate. That's why you failed in South America. The same strategy won't work elsewhere." A ripple of surprise moved through the table. She wasn't just making a point, she was making a strong, undeniable argument. The executive scoffed. "And you believe these so-called partnerships would be enough? They'd be a start?" She countered. "You can't expect loyalty from a market you don't respect. The people running businesses in those regions aren't naive. They see companies like yours come and go, taking profits while giving little in return. That's why your competition is doing better. They understand the value of collaboration." The murmurs around the table grew louder. Some nodded, exchanging glances. Others leaned in, clearly intrigued. The younger executive who had supported Eleanor earlier spoke up again. "She makes a valid point. We've been overlooking long-term sustainability for short-term gains." Nicholas smirked, watching the shift happen right in front of him. The executive's face darkened, his frustration barely hidden. "This is absurd," he muttered under his breath, but he could see it. He was losing control of the conversation. Before he could argue further, one of the senior board members, a man whose opinion carried weight, cleared his throat. "Perhaps it's time we reevaluate our approach. Fresh perspectives are always valuable." That was it, the final blow. Eleanor had not only defended herself, she had turned the conversation in her favor. The executive sat back, defeated. Nicholas, for the first time that evening, broke his silence. "Well," he said, looking at Eleanor with something close to admiration, "it seems bringing my housekeeper to dinner was the best decision I've made in a long time." A stunned silence followed. And then, slowly, laughter erupted from a few guests at the table. Not mocking, not cruel, genuine amusement and appreciation. Eleanor exhaled, finally letting herself relax, but she didn't miss the way Nicholas was looking at her now. It was different, as if, for the first time, he was really seeing her. By the time the dinner ended, the whispers had changed. The judgment had faded, replaced by curiosity, by something dangerously close to respect. As they stepped outside, the cool night air washing over them, Eleanor turned to Nicholas. "Was this all some kind of test?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. He chuckled. "Not exactly, but I had a feeling you'd surprise them." She shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "And did I surprise you?" Nicholas met her gaze, and for the first time the confident, untouchable businessman hesitated. "Yes," he admitted, "you did." A long pause stretched between them before he added, almost thoughtfully, "You don't belong in the shadows." "Eleanor." She held his gaze, understanding the weight of his words. "Maybe, just maybe, this night was the beginning of something bigger. Something neither of them had seen coming."